But if the idea is we have to wait until humans just like boop, click in and realize we are nature, all the public lands are going to be gone. Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis and all that good stuff. I'm doing another one of my solo podcasts every other week. I have my grandpa sweater on, so that's how you know I'm serious. And I wanted to talk to you about an issue that has come up repeatedly in advocacy over the years, environmental advocacy. And there was recently on our Substack, which is ecointegrityalliance.substack.com, there was, I wouldn't even call it a debate, I would say it's more of a discussion because we pretty much agreed with each other, but it brought up an important point that I wanted to delve into. And basically it is the focus on public lands ecosystems versus, quote, private lands. So the idea of national forests, BLM lands, national parks, the environmental movement, whatever you want to call it, the focus has been on those lands, whereas private industrial timberlands or individual private lands or corporate lands, that tends to be fallen by the wayside. And I'm going to read, without saying the person's name, because I'm not sure they would want me, or maybe they would want me to do it, but I wanted to highlight this discussion and I want to hear what people have to say about it. But here are my thoughts and this person's thoughts. So I'll just read some of this and then I'll go into my patented opinionated ranting. So this was a response to this piece we wrote about the Forest Service, basically to defund the Deforest Service, which you can check out on our Substack. And this is what the individual said. They said, sure, the government agencies that facilitate destruction of public lands are part of the problem. But this is a rather reductionist view. What about all the consumers of dead tree products? That's the root of the problem. Eliminate the wrongful living / overconsumption and no trees would be killed. If people demand wood products, trees will be killed and the government will never do anything about it. So here was my short initial reply. Absolutely agree that human overconsumption is a root cause of the eco-crisis. There's no doubt about that. We take, and then the corporations and government agencies, they basically facilitate that taking. Obviously, they ramp it up maybe more than we need, and I get into it in a second. Anyway, however, in the case of public lands where U.S. only gets 4% of its wood, we think agency corruption is more the issue here. No? So acknowledging that point of the overconsumption, but because such a tiny percentage of public lands wood is part of our consumption, it's almost a moot point. So it's not really about the consumption here. It is about the agencies and the corporations that want this taxpayer money and they want the free, basically, access to public lands. So his response was, I have a different perspective on the concept of, quote, public lands. I don't believe in the ridiculous idea of land ownership to begin with. People can use and possess land, but they don't own it any more than they can own the air. The concept of land ownership is a mental disease that was brought here from Europe as the natives here didn't recognize it. Therefore, I'm concerned with all lands equally, not just public lands. As I said, government agencies that facilitate destruction of public land are certainly a problem, but the problem goes way beyond them. Even if we made all public lands pristine with absolutely no human development, roads, mining, drilling, or livestock grazing, that would only be a small fraction of land in this country. How about we fight for all the land and not just some of it that a group of people have designated as, quote, public? So I think there are some valid points here, and here's the response. We agree that there is no real difference between, quote, public and so-called, quote, private land other than legally. So in terms of general advocacy for the land base, it totally makes sense to speak for all the ecosystem. So agreed with the general point there. That being said, in terms of getting actual protections on the ground, it is far more difficult to get private lands protections, which is something we have worked on in terms of corporate timberlands and herbicide spraying. So I was referring to how a lot of us in our movement have been pushing back against, quote, private land logging. Particularly my experience was primarily in Oregon, where these private lands, so-called private lands, are logged to shreds by these big timber companies. So they're logging public lands, but they're also logging private lands and doing all sorts of clear cutting and nasty stuff there. And the other issue is they're doing herbicide spraying from helicopters or planes, which then drifts into the watersheds and actually onto people's property. So we definitely have engaged with that, engaged with it on the state level in terms of the way taxes work, and the timber companies get away with it. But I'll tell you what, it's so difficult because of the way that the legal system has been set up that it is a very difficult thing to address. Doesn't mean shouldn't address it, and we did work on that, and there are folks working on that. But then here is the response where I follow up. Meanwhile, public lands already have legal avenues for protection due to the existing ownership and contain some of the last intact ecosystems out there. Because while a lot of private land is, of course, valuable land, all land is important, public lands tends to be what I call our last best ecosystems. So just making that distinction as well, not to diminish the other private lands, but meaning our take is if we can't protect even the low-hanging fruit on public lands, we don't stand a chance at saving a stick on private land. And I continue, if we're able to get actual public lands protection instead of decreasing protections, as has been occurring for decades, we can build on our successes to address more on private land. But until then, the vision of protecting all land seems very unlikely to come true simply by wishing it to be so. Our belief is that we have to take practical mission-based actions that may lead us step by step to genuine ecosystem protection while never losing that bigger vision that we share. Otherwise, what actions would you suggest is what I asked of this person. So again, agreeing, yes, private lands equally important, but we have a legal framework right now where just saying protect the land doesn't protect the land. So we can have a philosophy around it. And I agree. And we do have that philosophy at Eco Integrity Alliance. And I think most deep ecologists, or however you want to frame that, is yes, all land important. But in terms of how do we actually advance protection? How do we do practical organizing and advocacy on the ground versus coming up with our theories and ideas, which can then direct our advocacy? So I think sometimes it's that disconnect between I'm a writer, I can write things, or I can write a story about something, but then how does that actually become real on the ground? Not saying it is too difficult to do, or that it's certainly that it's not that it's impossible, but it's that can we take step by step moving towards a goal? I think there is a difference between compromising and saying, go ahead, log private land. That's what some people do. In fact, a lot of conservation groups do that. And a lot of conservation groups, they advocate for public lands logging. And then we have fake conservation groups like the Nature Conservancy, my favorite whipping boy, that logs both private and public lands. So they're not really a conservation group. But anyway, so giving up the land, absolutely not. Taking the steps towards protecting it in a rational and practical manner, I still think is the best way to do it. I asked, what other actions would you suggest? But again, the premise is, if we can't even protect public lands, which are supposed to be protected and we all own it, does just saying so protect these private lands? So that's the general argument. And then the response was, I fully agree, except that protecting and restoring all land is doable. Private lands will just take a lot longer. I was just saying that we shouldn't ignore root causes while working on fixing symptoms. Totally agree. And I rebutted saying we're all about root causes. I mean, that is the foundation of what Eco Integrity Alliance is, what the Green Root podcast tackles. So I disagree with the idea of addressing public lands as treating a symptom. I think that's not quite true, but it gets into more specifics here. But unfortunately, that might be embedded deep in our DNA and not a quick fix, but will likely involve a kind of psychological or even spiritual evolution in our species, a change in our ways of life and economic systems. So that, I believe, is a root cause of environmental destruction and and devastation, what he referred to as overconsumption, which I certainly agree with. But what is the root of that overconsumption? Why do we insist on this? Yes, corporations are kind of making us in a way, but we're also kind of feeding into it as well. So that's a big, large-scale evolutionary change, which I don't personally know how to do advocacy on that. I encourage people to meditate, and maybe psychedelics will help. I don't know. We do a lot of stuff that addresses the underlying cause, and getting people out into the forest to rekindle their connection to nature, I think is a big thing. But if the idea is we have to wait until humans just like boop, click in and realize we are nature, all the public lands are going to be gone. All the private lands are going to be gone. We don't have that luxury. Can we simultaneously be doing practical steps towards a goal that isn't compromising or giving things away while addressing the underlying causes? So basically what I say here, well, exactly what I say is, in the meantime, we can prioritize strategies that might result in stopping extraction on publicly owned lands as we also work on the deeper causes. Protecting public lands would require some overlap with private, but also some very different angles since the law around them is different. We have to be able to tackle specific aspects of the problem while, as you say, not lose sight of the bigger picture. No? So that tends to happen a lot in advocacy. People are working on a piece and people are like, yeah, but what about this piece? And it's like, cool, but we also have to do one piece at a time, right? It's sort of like if you say a statement and they're like, what about this? I have to say one word at a time and one sentence at a time. I think if you're ignoring the other piece, that's a problem. And that's why this concept that Eco Integrity Alliance is trying to promote is we are tying into all aspects of the eco crisis, but some of us are going to have our focus. The question is, how does that dovetail with what other folks are doing? And so I mentioned the last thing here is, again, we're open to suggestions, but right now our focus is protecting all public lands, which are already supposedly protected to a large degree as biodiversity, watershed, and climate refugia. Is that not a worthy goal? So my take is simply that public lands are the low-hanging fruit. If we can't do that, we can't do anything else. And once we do that, we can build upon our successes to tackle the larger pieces. So that's my general overall philosophy on this. I think it's a really good discussion/debate. I appreciated the debate there. But notice when I asked specific questions about what practical steps as an organizer rather than a philosopher would you suggest, there weren't any. And it's not because this person doesn't have them and maybe they just didn't continue the thread. I'm not trying to make this antagonistic. I appreciated this exchange. But organizing on the ground is a very different thing. It is practical day-to-day actions that we can take, and we are working within a certain legal framework, and we are working within a certain ideological framework of lands owned right now, say by the U.S. government, which is technically run by us, we the people. Now, do I personally endorse the idea that the forest behind me is America or... No, it's nature. So I don't personally buy into it. But for me to go into, say, trying to create legislation and saying America doesn't exist, I don't know where I'm going to get with that. I do think, however, it is a worthwhile endeavor to always remember those bigger picture things and not get too caught up in these ideological concepts of, this public lands. It's like, all right, public lands, but there's not really such a thing as that. It's just nature. But in the meantime, how would you propose that we get the extraction corporations off of public lands? How would you propose that the entities that are running it right now, such as the U.S. Forest Service, which are just partners of extraction, land mismanagement agencies, does telling them that they don't really own the land, that the land belongs to itself, at the end of the day, does that protect a single tree? I don't think that it does. So that's our own personal philosophy, and I agree with that. I 100% agree with that. But how do we engage in the practical way in the world we live in right now? And again, what I'm suggesting is we don't do either or. We both follow through with specific public lands protections. In this case, not fighting timber sale by timber sale, separately. That's part of it. But having this larger positive vision, a new direction for public lands, some might say, and at the same time acknowledging these concepts are arbitrary. Nature is the real piece of this, but most people are not in that headspace. And those of us who might be, we have to meet people where they are without selling out our own values. So that is something I am constantly struggling with. And that's why I do appreciate this nudge to better formulate the position. So yeah, at the end of the day, I agree with this person that these lands don't belong to us. They don't belong to anyone, right? But some people think they do, and those people are harming the land. So how do we address that right now while having this long-term vision and strategy and goal of nature is its own thing and we are also nature? That's the question. And if I could figure out a way to do advocacy in reminding people that we are nature, I would focus more and more on that. But I noticed, yes, I can take people out into the forest on hikes and get them to engage in the ecology and the experience, because I think it's ultimately almost a spiritual experience of connecting with nature. And we do that through Eco Integrity Alliance. But if they just go out there and then we're like, okay, bye, and then they're just logging that area 2 weeks later, that hasn't accomplished the goal. So philosophy versus advocacy and organizing, I would say, might be the root of the debate there, while incorporating positive practical action and long-term vision. So that's a mission, day-to-day what you do to carry things out, and a vision, this larger overarching concept. So I hope that was helpful or not too confusing or a waste of your time or boring or whatever. So thanks for listening. I do want to hear from you. Should we be focusing at Eco Integrity Alliance and the larger movement on protecting public lands? Should we act as if there is no legal distinction between public and private lands? And further, do you have specific suggestions for how to engage in those matters, particularly on private lands? And do you have any ideas for how to do this bigger picture, connecting people back to nature? So I want to hear that in the comments. Please let us know. Like, share, subscribe, do the things that you have to do so we can have a voice, because the corporate and state-funded media is actively suppressing us. And in fact, I would say YouTube in some ways has been throttling our views, because when we post stuff on other platforms like Substack, they go semi-viral, and then we'll get like a few dozen views on YouTube. So something's happening. You can help with that. Practical action. Think about how you would spiritually help our work as well, and the larger vision of it. But also, please take a practical action and like, comment, share, whatever. All the above we need to do. Thank you.